Russia has intensified its attacks in eastern Ukraine while war fatigue seems to be growing in Kyiv. Russia now says it is advancing on all sections of the front line and registered some gains in the eastern villages as well. But the latest, Ukraine says 2 power lines connecting its electricity grid to the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant were cut overnight. This put the plant at the risk of an accident. Kyiv says the plant was on the verge of a nuclear and radiation accident before off-site power was restored by Ukraine. Time and again, Zaporizhzhia plant became the center of fighting since it was taken over by Russian forces last year. Both sides often accuse each other of compromising its safety. Despite minor changes being made on the front lines, intense fighting has continued in several regions. The recent battle has been centered around industrial town of Avdiivka, where Ukraine says it is engaging with Russian forces. Russia launched a bid to capture the town in October. Earlier, Moscow also claimed to take control of Kromov, a small village on the outskirts of Bakhmut.
Группировки российских войск наносят ВСУ эффективное и мощное огневое поражение. В результате их боевые возможности значительно снижены.
Russian President Vladimir Putin also signed a decree to ramp up its forces by 170,000 troops. The number of servicemen in Russian army currently stands at 1.3 million. The Russian Defense Ministry says the strength is being increased due to the growing threats to Moscow associated with special military operation. Special operation is how Russia describes its invasion of Ukraine. This comes at a time when Ukraine is struggling to recruit soldiers. The wartime President Volodymyr Zelensky says changes are needed in its mobilization system. Corruption and recruitment has been pressing issues for Ukraine for some time now. Calls for demobilizations have also been rising in Ukraine. Early on Friday, Ukraine says Russia launched 25 drone attacks overnight, killing 1 person and injuring another in southern Kherson. While in the town of Mykolaiv, a warehouse suffered damage. Ukraine also added it downed 18 drones that had been launched from southwestern Russia and Crimea. Ukraine's agency claimed to have detonated explosives on a Russian railway line in Siberia earlier. This was the second such attack on military supply routes this week. Russia says train was blown up in a terrorist act by unidentified individuals. Trans-Siberian railway network is essential for Russian freight transport. With the winter reaching its peak, Kyiv fears Russia will try to destroy Ukraine's critical energy infrastructure. The White House has said that U.S. is helping prepare Ukraine for expected Russian winter attack. Fred Weir is a journalist and also political commentator from Moscow. He is now joining us live on the show. Welcome, Fred. It's winter season and Kyiv is facing war fatigue. How is that likely to play out as far as the war is concerned?
Well, it's still very difficult to predict when and how this war will end. But it is clear that we've passed some kind of a turning point in the recent months. The big Ukrainian offensive has clearly failed, I mean, utterly and completely failed. And yesterday, Volodymyr Zelensky did say that that Ukraine is going to start building defensive lines, much as the kind the Russians had built earlier, which is pretty much the final admission that Ukraine isn't going to be retaking any of that territory that Russia seized anytime soon. So we do see the initiative passing to the Russians all along the front line in the past month or so. The victories, and you enumerated them a few minutes ago, are still very small. We're talking about incremental gains. But it is a war of attrition. Russia is grinding down the Ukrainian forces. They are suffering terribly. The Russians are taking a beating too. It's just horrendous war. It just, you know, when the casualties become known, I think we're all going to be horrified. But so far, the mathematics does favor Russia, and the tide does seem to be turning in Russia's favor. Right. And I think that Putin's announcement of beefing up the forces means that Russia will be, over the winter, accumulating a new army, not one that's pinned down on the front line, but in Russia, training them, arming them, to launch some sort of a fresh attack, perhaps from the north, in the springtime.
Fred, let's talk about what you've just mentioned there, the mathematics of this war, and also you've just said that the counteroffensive by Ukraine is failing. Looking at that, how would you gauge the war moving forward? Because it has been 2 years, almost 2 years, past 2 years now. How would you gauge the war to be likely to play out in the next year or so?
I think we can hope that it won't be another year. It is dawning in Kyiv and in Western capitals that Ukraine is not going to win the war. As maybe a year ago, there was a lot of euphoria, a lot of hope and reasons to hope that Ukraine might deal some sort of a knockout blow to Russia. It's pretty clear now that Russia is not only holding on and taking the initiative, but the Russian economy is gearing up to a war footing. None of the calculations of crippling Russia with sanctions have played out. On the contrary, the Russian economy is growing and turning to war production on a very big scale. Russia's manpower reserves are still strong. They have like 20 million people on the reserve list who could be mobilized if needed, whereas Ukraine is clearly scraping the bottom of the barrel for manpower. I read the other day that the average age in the Ukrainian army is 43. I mean, the average age of soldiers in World War II in Allied forces was like 22. This is terrible, and I think it bespeaks the real destruction that's been wreaked upon Ukraine by this war. So I'm not saying it's to be hoped for that Ukraine will collapse or anything like that. They've fought with such courage and determination and for their own country, but I hope that it's dawning on people by now that there need to be peace talks. There needs to be some kind of a settlement, a legal one, that will end this.
All right, I've been talking to a journalist and political commentator, Fred Weir. Thank you very much for talking to us today.
Thank you.
WION is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news on the move.